So March is Women's History Month, which is why we really wanted to host a talk about a remarkable woman or women in the county, specifically someone who had an impact that was pretty far-reaching, because we're trying to connect more things to contemporary times and not just focus on the distant past. So Olympia Brown, who you will be hearing about today, is just such a woman. And another woman who is also that person is Dr. Eileen Raymond. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her before she gets started. And yes, quite a list. She's got quite a background. So Dr. Eileen Raymond taught for 22 years in college programs preparing special educators after teaching for 10 years in the public schools. As a special educator and while raising a son with a learning disability. She served as Associate Dean in the School of Education and Professional Studies at SUNY Potsdam from 2005 to 2009, where she was responsible for the university's assessment program and served as the National Council for the Accreditation of Teacher Education Coordinator. I had to look up what that acronym meant.
That means the people will tell you what to do.
So she was awarded Professor and Associate Dean Emeritus status upon her retirement from SUNY Potsdam in 2009. And then she spent a year serving as a Fulbright Scholar at the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, where she taught and helped revise the programs related to inclusive education. Her current research interests include issues related to serving diverse audiences with disabilities, and special interest in universal design for learning, global inclusive education initiatives, and language diversity. Dr. Raymond is also a lifelong Universalist and has been a member of the UU Church in Canton, right next door. Many of our friends are here today. For over 30 years. She also leads the church's History Learning Circle, who are currently preparing for the congregation's 200th anniversary in 2025. And we're hoping to do some partnering. They've been using our archives, digging up some history, and we're very excited because they're way ahead of the game in doing this research. So exciting things coming for 2025. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Eileen Raymond.
One little disclaimer.
Only one?
I grew up as a Unitarian.
wow.
Stevie Michelson grew up as a Universalist, and we paired together a few years back to do a presentation on Universalism in the North Country, and it was fun to compare our past experiences pre-merger and then post-merger. I feel, since I've come to St. Lawrence County, I've come to appreciate in a whole much more enlarged way the role that Universalism has played in our life here in this county, and the role that it really played across this country, and you'll see a lot of that today. So we're here today to talk about Olympia Brown, who was born in 1835 and died in 1926, a ripe old age. Her family, her parents were married in Vermont, and shortly after their marriage they trekked across the countryside to Schoolcraft, Michigan, where Olympia was born. This is Olympia. That's her mother and dad, and the other three children were born subsequent to that. She was the oldest in the family. This picture shows her at age 13. And they were Universalists. They were strong Universalists. Their mother taught them in the home for a number of years of their pre-formal education, reading, writing, spelling, arithmetic, and the tenets of the Universalist faith, including salvation is extended to all human beings, not just the elite, that God is kind and loving, not angry and vengeful, and that there is no such thing as a place in hell. So that was her background. was that we are all in this thing together, and none of us is special, and all of us are special. Just a bit of background for those of you who may not be familiar with the Universalist tradition. In the belief system, formal belief system back in 1803 was codified not as a creed, but as a statement of faith that most Universalists would agree with. The Old and the New Testaments reveal the character of God, so recognizing the Bible as authoritative. There is one God, not a triumvirate. And holiness and happiness are inextricably bound. So these were folks who really believed in a loving God that loved all of us and lived their lives in accordance with that. And we saw in this county, and see in my research, by the 1900s there were almost 34, 35 separate congregations in this county alone. So it was very, very important in this county. They also, the Browns also, and Olympia herself, were quite indebted to Hosea Ballou, who was known informally as Father Ballou, and he brought that Universalist message across the northern part of New York, Vermont, New Hampshire. So his influence was responsible for a lot of the Universalist stuff you see around here today. Olympia learned some very early lessons about equality. In her, oops, did we move? Oh no, I got you. Her father believed in education, and education for the girl child as well as the boy child. He built a log cabin. This is not it. I had to find one that seemed to match the description. But a log cabin on the edge of his farm, and he went around and got other farmers to send their kids, and they all chipped in money, and the state tipped in a little money. So they had a kind of a functioning little one-room schoolhouse. They hired a teacher, and Olympia and her siblings got their first early education, formal education, in this schoolhouse. She had learned some very early lessons about equality and also inequality. In keeping with the Universalist principles, men and women are equal. They are deserving of the same respect, the same opportunities. That was how she was raised. They had family and neighbors, the Nathans, who lived next door to the next door farm, who were Quakers and were actually a functioning station on the Underground Railroad. This is back in Schoolcraft, Michigan. Olympia, the stories are told that she was very interested in talking to one of the Negro men who came to live with the Nathans rather than going on to Canada, and got to know him as a person. And it just puzzled the heck out of her that he wouldn't have rights like everybody else. So this was nagging at her from a very early age. Her formal schooling happened at about age 13. She went to the local school, and again, this is probably not the building, but it is in Schoolcraft, Michigan. A little bit later vintage, but not modern. She struggled there because she couldn't understand why the boys were treated differently than she was as a girl. The boys were expected to do things like debate and to present their arguments orally. The girls were not. And those of us with the kind of hair I've got, and everybody in this room, saw the same thing in our own lives when the girls took home ec and the boys took shop. And what if you wanted to take shop? That wasn't on the program for us. So after a year there, she took a term staying at home back in the farm school. But then realized she needed to finish this education. This was important. So she went back to Cedar Park and graduated. Higher education was another real challenge for Olympia. She started working on where she would go to get her higher education. She was committed, and her family was as well. Her parents, both of them, were very committed to her receiving all the education she wanted and could handle. So at age 19, she finally settled on Mount Holyoke, which was fairly new at the time and hadn't been in operation very long, and offered a higher education experience for young women. Well, there were several problems with this one, and when you hear the description of Mount Holyoke in those days, it would make whatever hair you've got frizz and go, ah! One thing, there were a whole lot of rules, things you could and couldn't do. And every afternoon at 4 o'clock, they were all required to assemble and to recite all of the rules. The rules were very important. They also had a lot of curricular restrictions. Chemistry was not going to be part of the program, and all of that kind of stuff. And for very good reason, she decided that this probably wasn't the right place for her. And she had long conversations with her mother. I'm going to read you a little bit from a letter that her mother wrote to her. It would cause me, let me get this right. It would cause me the most poignant sorrow were you to be the dupe of supercilious bigotry. That was the other thing. They were on her case constantly about becoming a professing Christian. Whatever that means. Dismiss the subject of creeds for the present and be content with a pure heart, a conscientious discharge of duty, a resignation and trust in God. I think a visit into Vermont will do you good, both in mind and body. It will serve you in some measure to break the thraldom that surrounds you. Go and enjoy it. I would not have you stay be their victim for no amount of money. Perhaps I do them injustice, but I suspect the reason why they have you go so slow in your studies is that the mind unoccupied may more easily become their prey. It was not the Mount Holyoke that most of us know today, for sure. But back then, it was not a good place. So that lasted a year, and she went off to Vermont that summer, and was not too happy about doing anything else about that. So she researched. She looked high and low. She looked strongly at Oberlin. That was there were some good things about it, but it didn't quite measure up. She finally ended up choosing Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. So she was there for her 4 years of undergraduate education. Antioch was non-sectarian. There were no required religious studies. It was co-educational. Boys and girls attended, not just girls. And the liberal spirit and curriculum were ever present. It was a forward-looking thing, and you can assume that was because of the leadership of Horace Mann, who started Antioch. In fact, it was such a successful experience for Olympia that her whole family moved from Michigan to Yellow Springs so that all of the children could take advantage of this wonderful place that she had found. So this is a family that's very committed to their kids' education. This is just a little bit of, whoops, why is it doing that? That's interesting. That's supposed to be more a picture than that, but well, you have to imagine that there's a head on that one.
It's the bottom part.
Yeah, this is the bloomer Yes. Phrase. The pants below the shorter skirt. And apparently this was something that she was wont to wear during her school days. But she's a pragmatist. She gave it up when she left school because she was tired of people giving her a hard time about it. So, this little nitpick. After she graduated from Antioch, she and her father had this conversation. And Opie says, "You're probably wondering what I'm going to do now that I've graduated." Dad said, "Yeah, that we are. You've decided you want to teach after all?" She said, "No, I've decided I want to be a minister." Well, it took him a little bit by surprise. But he said, "Well, have at it, girl. You can find a seminary, you can go." So that was fun. That was very, very hard, finding a seminary. She spent the next year at home with her family. And the wandering in the wilderness really seemed to resonate with me as I read the story. She really wanted this. She felt the need to preach, to be a minister to others. And she didn't know how to do that, and she was going to spend this year to do it. So she had to find out someone who would admit her. Well, that was precious few. Would any school be a good fit? She didn't need to be in a school that had strong doctrinal requirements the way Mount Holyoke did. She knew she would face gender discrimination wherever she went. How could she solve that? She was concerned about working women. She did a lot of studying during this year. The conditions of working women in the United States. And the issue of property rights really intrigued her. She had not realized that as a woman, she would not be in control of her own property. Of course, we know now not only her property, but her body. But there are a whole list of these injustices that started nagging at her brain. And she knew that part of her ministry had to address some of these, as many of these as possible as she could do. Well, those of us in Canton know what she found. The Universalist convention in New York State in the 1940s started really seriously looking at how to educate their ministers. And they put out a bid to build a theological school. Can you get it, Roger? That's not part of it, no.
She got a cell phone when she was there?
Yeah, she got a cell phone, but she was very ahead of her time.
Good woman. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Anyway, the Universalists were trying to figure out where to do this and how to do it. And they put out a bid for communities to apply to be the host for this new school. And two communities came to the forefront. Clinton, not Clinton over here in Plattsburgh, but Clinton down south of here. Clinton, which was currently the home of the liberal seminary down there, that was a high school kind of seminary, not a theological school. And Canton made a very strong proposal. And as Stevie and I found out, that part of the strong reason that we got it here was because the Ladies' Circle and the governing body of the Universalist Church, the building next door, were able to raise a pile of money, $20,000, I believe. And they also had access to land on the hill. And those clinched the deal. So the Universalist Convention of New York decided to build a seminary here. And it did start out as the framework was for the Theological School. What we also know is that the Universalists up here felt it was very important for all of their children to have access to what they called a non-partialist education. not affected by the tenets of partialism, i.e. not all of you go to heaven. And they wanted a good non-sectarian education for their children. So there was a strong base to build not only the theological school that the denomination wanted, but also the preparatory school, which became what we now know as St. Lawrence University. And this was the first building. This is where Olympia went to meet with Ebenezer Fisher, and where all of they lived there, they studied there, they ate there, they met their professors there, everything. Ebenezer Fisher was the president of the time, and he plays a really big role in her life. Fisher's letter to her bears some thinking about. The letter said, "You will be admitted into the school and have all the opportunities that the school provides. You must bring satisfactory testimonies as to your moral and religious character, believe in the Holy Scripture, and you must have a fixed determination to devote your life to the Christian ministry. These are conditions for all divinity students." Sounds like fits. Then he says, "Tuition is free. Board costs $2.25 per week, including washing. Students supply their own bedding and room furniture. You may want to consider boarding with a private family." This was the first little inkling in this thing that he was cautioning her that something might be difficult. Then again in the same letter, we get more. He pointed out that there had never been any female students and there were unlikely to be any. "However, if you feel that He, God, has called you to preach the everlasting gospel, you shall receive from me no hindrance." "But rather every aid in my power. I do not think that women are called to the ministry, but I leave that between you and the great head of the church." To which Olympia said, "That's as it should be." She was nothing if not forthright. Okay, so the summer finishes. Olympia makes the trip to Canton. You have to remember, she's a short little woman. She was small. She was mighty, but she was small. So she walks into the building, finds Fisher's office, knocks on the door, and introduces herself. "I've come to begin my studies for the ministry," says she. Fisher says, "I see. Yes, Olympia Brown. I really was not expecting you, Miss Brown. I thought my letters would discourage you." You didn't know her very well, did you? "Oh no, they actually encouraged me," she said. "I want very much to become a minister." "Well, as I told you, you'll be the only female here on campus." And Olympia says, "That doesn't bother me, and it shouldn't bother the other students either if they're really serious about their studies." And Fisher concluded, "Well, Miss Brown, I'll help you as much as I can." So it was,
He seems rather reluctant.
well, he's cautionary, let's put it that way. Okay, so she's engaging. She really loved the preaching stuff, the opportunity to practice her oratorial skills and all this good stuff, and she did very well in the program. She did some supply preaching rather, here in St. Lawrence County, in Ogdensburg, and in Hewelton during breaks and summer vacations, that kind of thing. And she was the first woman to graduate from the Theological School. She applied at the time in 1863. She applied to the St. Lawrence Association of Universalists for ordination. Now, one thing you got to understand here, because we'll come back to this in a few minutes, there's a bit of controversy as to who was the first woman to be ordained. And one of the problems is that the Universalist tradition was very grassroots centric. It was very loose on hierarchy. I mean, they had a structure, but they deferred a lot of stuff to the local community, the local groups of churches, and that's exactly what was happening here. The St. Lawrence Association for Universalists was the governing group of ministers that served our area. They were meeting in Malone. She took herself off to Malone and to present her case for ordination. This is where Fisher comes back into this story. He opposed her ordination because he didn't think women should be ministers. One of the things that happened was, over the course of things, he changed his mind on this to the extent that when she was ordained that summer, he actually participated in the service of ordination, and that was a good sign that she was able to make progress when people weren't necessarily seeing her. So, June 25th, 1863, she was now an ordained minister. What next? Well, if you're going to be a minister, what do you need? A church. Or 2 or 3. Well, she started off with sort of 2. She started off with 2 Universalist churches in Vermont, one in East Montpelier and one in Marshfield. And she served both of them part-time for a little bit of time. So milestone, what happened in 1864? Well, she felt like she really wanted her own church full-time. This was a goal of hers. And so she took herself off to Boston. I didn't know the Universalists were in Boston, but apparently they were. So she's talking to people in Boston, trying to have them help her find a place to be a minister. Successfully, she was allowed to come and do a trial sermon in Weymouth Landing, Massachusetts, which is south of Boston. And they hired her on the spot. Weymouth Landing was like a lot of small Universalist churches. It was a big struggle. They were always short of money. They were short of everything they needed. They sometimes were not doing nice with each other. And Weymouth Landing had a lot of these same problems. The fact that she stayed there for 5 years and they left with nothing, and when she resigned, they did not want her to leave. It says a lot about her as an individual human being. Throughout the time that she was at Weymouth Landing, she continued to develop this sense of the need for women's equality and women's suffrage in particular. She had some connections with Susan B. Anthony at the time, and some of the other old names in the suffrage movement. So she was beginning to get her suffrage feet under her. In the summer of 1867, she was approached by Lucy Stone of suffrage fame to spend 4 months in Kansas working for suffrage. Well, she's in the middle of this ministry that she's just gotten off the ground and whatnot, and she wasn't sure about that, but she thought, well, I really should do that, and the church gave her leave for the summer to do that. And that decision gave her the opportunity to start linking up with some of the other stalwarts of the movement, Susan Anthony, Stanton, and Stone. In fact, they wanted her to come and work full-time for the movement. She wasn't ready to be there yet. So she returned to her church in Weymouth, finished out the 5th year, and off she goes. She she did decide that she wanted a slightly bigger church, so she accepted the call to serve the Universalist Church in Bridgeport, Connecticut. One of the things about her ministries is that she tends to come in, take advantage of situations that are difficult, and she loves a challenge. And Bridgeport was definitely one of those. This is P.T. Barnum's church, so there's some big old money there, but there were also some real strong detractors to her and continuing to be there. She did marry there. She had her husband, John Willis, she had met him in Weymouth Landing, and he followed her. And they had 2 children during the time that she was there. But she continued the suffrage work as her time permitted. She had made that decision that she didn't want to do it full time, but as she had time, and she always seemed to find some time. But there was a very strong dissenter in the church, as sometimes happens, and it caused so much turmoil that she finally resigned. She realized she was in an untenable situation. So at that point, she accepted the call to serve the Church of the Good Shepherd, which was a Universalist church in Racine, Wisconsin. This church was in very dire straits. The descriptions of it included words like hopeless. To which Olympia says, "Oh, that's just my kind of church." So she arrived and she settled in and won them over and all that good stuff, as she did everywhere else. In 1884, she was elected president of the Wisconsin State Suffrage Association. And so she stayed at Good Shepherd for 9 years. That was a long time. So she has almost 20 years of ministry now under her belt. Come 1887, she had completed her 9th year there. She was 52. And keep in mind that this is in 1887, where 52 was not young. At age 52, she resigned her ministry, and she finally said yes to the call to work full-time for suffrage. So this is when her whole career changed. What she did with it didn't change. She's still out there preaching and informing people and haranguing them and doing whatever else was necessary to make them see the light, whether it's a religious light or a civic one. We're going to talk about this issue with ordination. There is controversy different places. Anytime you want to call somebody the first to do something, somebody said, "Oh no, there was XYZ." And a number of things came into play here. Some of the procedures, particularly in the Universalist tradition, were not regularized. So in some cases, approval by a regional denominational body, or a national one, or the congregational one, would be how you got ordained. Getting academic training for ministry and having a degree. Evidence of a commitment to ministry, very strong in most people's minds. Letters of fellowship is kind of a handshake kind of process where you would get ordained because somebody decided you were ordainable, and you met whatever criteria they have in their head. And preaching experience for at least 1 year prior to ordination sometimes came into the so there's this various mix of criteria for how you got ordained. So there are some people in our history who, for one reason or other, have called to believe that they were ordained and may have been the first. Elizabeth Brown Blackwell was ordained by a local congregational congregation, but failed the test of some kind of regional or national denominational recognition. Lydia Perkins is a tough one. She, in many ways, sounds a lot like Olympia's situation. It took me a long time to find any place that actually said what the regional body was that was recognizing her. It does appear that it might have been the Ontario one. And if that's true, then the people who say that Lydia, get the L's mixed up, has claimed to be the first ordained woman would be true. Lydia, unfortunately, never really had a settled ministry, and she dropped out of being a minister very early. We never took a church, and became a medical doctor, and the rest is history. So whether we get hung up on this who was the first thing or not, I think we should need to put that one away. When we look at Olympia's history, she clearly represents what most reasonable people would say is someone who's committed to ministry, has the skills, knowledge, training to do it, and the personality to put up with some difficult people. Which most ministers would agree is probably the top criteria. As I looked for information about her and other people, one of the books that I found in our church library was this one, which I encourage you to take a look at. This was written by a woman. She goes by E.R. Hansen, and her first name is Eliza. And it's a compendium of women throughout history up to the point of 1884 when the book was published, of women, Universalist women, who had some reason for us to revere them. How did she come to do this thing? Well, she was on a train, Eliza was, traveling somewhere. And about 2 years ago, when traveling on an Iowa railroad, I fall into a conversation with a lady of a partialist faith. When with no little incredulity, she inquired, "What women in your church have distinguished themselves by a manifestation of Christian and or philanthropic zeal?" Casting about for an answer to his question, I was astonished at the long and brilliant procession. As the long and brilliant procession moved across the fluid of my mind's vision, and the longer I dwell on it, the greater an astonishment became. And at length I said, "Never did a church include a larger portion of notable women." She said she has a job. She's got to document this. And she did. Now the interesting part about this book, as you'll see if you look at it, is that I would guess 80% of it are Universalist women who were notable for a variety of things other than ministry. It's only the last little bit of the book that she starts dealing with Universalist ministers, because there weren't many. But there are a whole lot of Universalist women who are poets and suffragettes and all sorts of things. But it's fascinating just to look at it and you realize you're holding in your hands something that history is not finished yet. History is not finished yet, but it was starting. Another thing that you may come in your perusal of this whole topic is a group referred to informally as the Iowa Sisterhood. Just as we found Universalism taking strong hold here in rural St. Lawrence County, the West was another place that people moved to, but the men ministers didn't want to go there, because these churches were small, they didn't pay much, all sorts of problems. The men could take the positions in more established urban Eastern churches and get paid for it and recognized and all that good stuff. But the women who wanted to preach, who wanted to lead communities of faith found welcoming out in the prairies. And there's a whole lineage of them who were very, very important at helping create church families across the prairies in the rural areas. And they were a great support to each other, but they were also a great support to the women who lived in those communities as well. And there's a good, long, strong history of them in a book called Prophetic Sisterhood. That's actually from our church library. You can see the copy over there if you'd like to look more about that. But the Universalist message really did have a lot of traction in rural areas. And as the suffrage movement grew, these liberal ministries found another cause, and they tended to be very strong people working for suffrage, as well as all the others: abolition, suffrage, temperance, all the triune causes of the time. You see, this is just a sampling of women who are considered to be part of that sisterhood. So there's a lot. Olympia's got a lot of good company here. Suffragists on the march. Well, we're getting into the late 1900s. I mean, the late 1800s. In 1917, at age 82, Olympia's out marching. And you know that's not too long until we've going to take a little dive. This is a little bit out of order. Some of you may have heard of Helen Rich, who lived down south of here, and she was to the Universalism born. She has some local interest in her because of her poetry. She was considered the poet of the Adirondack. She wrote a lot of poetry. But she also was very committed to the suffrage cause, as well as abolitionists and temperance. She campaigned actively for those causes, and a few years ago, Maggie Hoggett, who lives here in Canton, did a video, theoretical kind of video about Helen's life. So if you're interested in more information about that, I bet Carlene can get you a link to that video. But she was a local person who was doing exactly the same thing except preaching, but she was doing those kind of things, and she really wanted to make a difference in the future. Okay. So the next milestone, of course, is the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Olympia Brown and millions of women then cast their very first votes on November 2nd, 1920. Apparently this getup she has on was her signature look. She looks a little grim in this picture. I don't think I would have tangled with her. We had a little bit more to come in the 1900s. Helen Drewley was graduated from the seminary, St. Lawrence Seminary, and she served as an assistant to James Payson, who was a minister at the UU Church, the First Universalist Church at the time. Harriet was ordained in 1922 with I don't find any indication that there was turmoil about that. So here we've come almost 50 years later, and another woman is following behind her footsteps. We have had Universalist ministers, including here in Canton. Edna Brunner got her bachelor's degree and her divinity degree from SLU. She was ordained by the Canton Church next door. She was the first woman to serve our congregation, and she was recruited after that to work for the Universalist Church of America on their field work program. She came to serve us in 1945 to 51, and then I had occasion to talk to Pat Dunkelberg, who many of you probably know, and she remembers Edna fondly. She would have been a young woman when Edna was serving the church, and she was a nice woman. So she did well. In 1993, we see our next woman coming to Canton. Now the woman is on the right, the left. Yeah. Ann Marsh and her husband Wade Wheelock came as a co-minister team, so this was a brand new idea too, to have a co-minister team coming to serve a congregation. And for the most, I mean, their ministry was very successful. They were here for 16 years? Yeah. 16 years. But when they came, there were still people who say, the minister and his wife. So she had to straighten them out. And if those of you who know Ann know she can do that. She did that.
Good woman.
So that's the next step. The Unitarian Universal Association was created from the Universalists and the Unitarians coming together in '61. It took until 2017 for us to have our first elected president of the denomination. Susan Frederick Gray is just finishing her sixth-year term. Interesting enough, it appears that the next president will also be a woman because there are only 2 women running for it. So unless somebody with a XY chromosome comes out of the woodwork, and we will have two women serving our denomination. And in all of these cases, all of these women ministers have had a really strong feeling about what it means to be a minister, and in meeting both the soul of the parishioners and the community, but also their minds and their spirits. They practically to a person found themselves fighting the fight wherever it needed to be fought for justice. Justice work is embedded in Universalist ministry, especially for the women ministers. They knew what it was like to not have justice, and so they were going to fight for it. How are we doing on time? Good. Okay. There's a woman who lives in Vermont. Don't need to leave that up there. Carol Eaglehart, who is a poet and songwriter, and she wrote a song called "Standing Before Us" that I'd like to close with, because I think it was written for International Women's Day, and I think it speaks a lot to what all of us, whether we're male or female, hope will be the message. Now, if you give me just a second to get this link up.
Oh, nice.
If you hate wearing bras, then you're going to want to listen up. 10 years ago, I gave up my regular bras and started wearing short bras as my regular bras until under outfit bras.
You want to skip that.
It doesn't dig into the shoulders. It offers great support. No pressure.
What church is
You never know. Well, with UU churches, you never know what you're going to get. Okay, everybody quiet.
Okay, here we go.
Oh.